Year 4 of the Clark Lea era is just around the corner in Nashville, Tennessee. We're talking all things Vanderbilt Commodores, and helping us do so, our good friend Will Byrum of the Dore Report. He joins the show. What's going on, Will? Appreciate you taking the time.
How's it going, Chris? I appreciate you having me.
Doing well, man. Excited to talk some Vandy football. Let me first commend you by saying you guys do a fantastic job covering all things Vanderbilt. We'll kick the show off there, Will. Let folks know they're tuning in, where they can find your work. Because as you can imagine, we were talking a little bit off air, it's not quite so easy to find quality Vanderbilt content. You and your co-host do a great job of that, though.
We are few, but we are mighty. If you want to follow some Vanderbilt content, we're most active on Twitter. Our Twitter handle's @the-Dore Report. Podcast available on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, all that good stuff. Just look up the Dore Report. Our Instagram handle is also the same as our Twitter, @the-Dore Report. We're not quite as active there. Still looking for somebody to kind of manage those Instagram posts, but check us out on Twitter @the-Dore Report.
So, Will, before we look ahead to this year, let's look back at 2023 for a moment. 2-10 final record, 0-8 in conference play. And you and I, again, were just talking off air. This time last year, Vanderbilt, believe it or not, was one of those kind of sexy teams going into the season, right? It was, you're coming off 2022 with the SEC wins over Kentucky and Florida. And listen, I'm a Clark Lea guy. Clark Lea, I think, is universally liked across the college ball landscape. So there was this belief like, hey, man, they're really building something in Nashville, bowl game or bust. Maybe they can get there. But all I heard was over 3.5 wins was the easiest money you could find on the board. Well, obviously that did not happen. And the early signs were there. You struggle in that game against Hawaii really out the gate. There were problems on the offensive line and in the secondary, which showed themselves. You had the game against Wake Forest, which was ugly. Then the game against UNLV. I thought that was the one that, when UNLV is trolling the SEC on social media, that's when you knew things were probably going to be bad. Just look back and talk about that 2023 season. How disappointing was that in the eyes of Vanderbilt fans? And what did you make of year 3 of Clark Lea?
Vanderbilt fans will put different words around, but in a simple term, indescribably disappointing. I mean, like you said, there was actually hype, a little bit of juice around this Vanderbilt football program. 2-10 in year 1 from Clark Lea. Had the first in 2021, had the first loss to an FCS program in history. In 2022, you saw a jump, won a couple SEC games, one on the road against Kentucky, went 5-7, and it felt like the natural progression. The next step would be make a bowl game. You kind of have the next heir apparent at quarterback. Mike Wright transfers to Mississippi State. You have A.J. Swan stepping in, who showed signs of being that guy. Had weapons all around him, a lot of returning receiver talent, returning talent on defense, and it just never materialized. From game 1, something was wrong. You mentioned that Hawaii game. I was there in the stadium for that game. They kind of jumped out early and then fell apart. And that was kind of the story of the rest of the season. You went on to beat Alabama A&M in week 2. I think the final score was 47-13 against Alabama A&M. Vanderbilt won, but it didn't feel that way in the stadium. Vanderbilt did not dominate at a 47-13 level. And from then on, you lost 10 straight to end out the season, and changes had to be made. And I'm not necessarily the highest Vanderbilt fan on this team going into year 4 under Clark Lea, but to give him benefit, he made changes. So there are a lot of changes on this Vanderbilt roster, on this Vanderbilt coaching staff, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, Will, and you mentioned Clark Lea, and that's where I want to go next, entering his 4th season. What's the mood in Nashville specifically around Clark Lea? Because like I mentioned, I'm not necessarily a Vanderbilt fan. Nothing against them, but obviously, again, I'm not as tied in close to the program. So I say I'm a Clark Lea guy, and others say as well. But what really matters is how fans of the program, boosters, those tied to it, feel about Clark Lea. This is a guy who cut his teeth there. We know that. He was a player there, so he gets it. But this is a big year 4 for him. What's the mood? What's the feeling? What's the vibe around Clark Lea right now?
So this is I've done a few of these podcasts with other fan bases. This is one of the more general. I want to have an easy soundbite for that. Now, I've told the story before, and it's one of those old coaching parables. But right now, I don't think the Clark Lea seat is quite as hot as what some SEC media members and national coverage of college football have it. But this is a big year for fans. Just want to see movement in the right direction. I mean, success is not always linear. Clark Lea said that during his SEC media days, but you are in year 4 and you've yet to make a bowl game, and things last year did not move in the right direction. But I talked about that old coaching parable. So it's the old parable that a coach writes 3 letters and hands it to the next coach at the university. He puts them into envelopes and says, every single time that something goes wrong and things get tough, open up one of these envelopes. So in envelope 1, he opens it up after things get tough, and the letter says, blame your predecessor. Clark Lea did that after year 1, blamed his predecessor and Derek Mason. Things got tough again, and you open up that second envelope. Inside the letter, it says, blame your coaching staff, blame your coordinators. That's what Clark Lea's doing right now. And then in envelope number 3, you open up that one and it says, go buy 3 envelopes. So right now, Clark Lea is kind of in that number 2 category. I don't think the seat is necessarily hot. I think he has at least 2 years left in Nashville, including year 4. So I think he'll be here this season, regardless of what happens, unless the unthinkable happens and they go 1-11 or something like that. I think he'll be back next year. But there is kind of a prove it. I think the phase of everybody just blindly being behind Clark Lea and in support is kind of gone. And I think it's fully a prove it mentality from the fan base right now.
And Will, like you mentioned, Clark Lea did make changes, and that starts on the offensive side of the football. Joey Lynch is out. Tim Beck is in as offensive coordinator. You also have a brand new quarterback in Diego Pavia, New Mexico State transfer, which he's most known, obviously, for last year, taking down the Auburn Tigers on the Plains in that big upset. Your top 4 pass catchers are gone. Guys like Will Shepard, London Humphreys, they're no longer around. So some questions at wide receiver. Who steps up in those spots, fills those voids, if you will, and just one starter back on the offensive line, blocking, leading the way for Cedric Alexander, and obviously paving the way for Diego Pavia. But things are going to look much different offensively with this Tim Beck scheme. Just talk about what you're expecting from Vanderbilt, not just from its new coordinator, but its new cast of characters on the offensive side as well.
Yeah, the offensive changes are going to be prevalent from week 1. Vanderbilt opens up the year against Virginia Tech, a tough opponent. But last year, Vanderbilt was very pass heavy. I think they threw the ball over 55% of the time, ranked in the top 30 of teams that passed the ball the most. New Mexico State, on the other hand, ran the ball 55% of the time, ranked top 40 in the country in percentage of run plays as a part of total offensive plays. So there's going to be a lot more running the football. Last year, Vanderbilt was kind of a traditional, more spread offense. This year is going to be a lot different, a lot of interesting, weird formations out of the pistol, prioritizing time of possession. And that's something Clark Lea hit on repeatedly during SEC media days, was just talking about there's going to be a new focus on time of possession, keeping in control of the game and keeping games close throughout, which they really struggled to do last year with turnovers.
Moving to the defensive side of the football, Will, Clark Lea taking over the defense. I think that's the big storyline there, really his bread and butter and what he's best known for. And it's a defense that struggled mightily as much as this team did last year. Passing defense was outside of the top 100 a season ago. You do get C.J. Taylor back at safety, who I think is a really nice player. Some new transfer portal corners in Marlon Jones Jr. and Colby Taylor. Langston Patterson is back to anchor the interior at the linebacker spot. And then 3 new starters on the defensive front, although they are veteran guys that are up there. But the big storyline here to me, Will, and again, you can piggyback off this, is Clark Lea taking over the defense. Because the biggest thing is this: when you're a coach, when the seat's starting to warm, or dare I say get hot, when you're not good at the thing that is your forte, that's your bread and butter, right? Because to your point, you can go get rid of your OC and get a new one. But when the defense is yours, or the offensive line is yours, or, the wide receivers, whatever it is, and that thing's not good, well, it's like, we got to go get a different you. Like, you're a problem as much as anything else. So talk about your confidence level and Clark Lea really taking control of the defense and what you're expecting from that group this year.
So I have pretty high expectations for this defense. For anybody out there that hasn't followed Clark Lea's career in detail, he's a defensive guy. Came to Vanderbilt from being the defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. That's his bread and butter. Runs a unique 4-2-5 style defense with an anchor and star position that's kind of hybrid defensive end linebacker, and then a hybrid safety linebacker position in there. One of the most underrated staff changes or staff moves that Vanderbilt made this offseason, Clark Lea shifted to the defensive coordinator / head coach role. But Vanderbilt also brought in New Mexico State's head coach from last season, and Jerry Kill, as an advisor to the head coach. So he's going to be taking on a lot of those quote unquote head coach responsibilities, specifically on the offensive side of the ball. And Jerry Kill is one of those really underrated acquisitions because he had some health issues, health concerns, and that's what's preventing him from being a full-time head coach at the collegiate level. A ton of experience, 25 plus years experience as a head coach in college football. He's a guy that can make an impact and allow Clark Lea to fully focus on the defensive side of the ball. And to be honest, it can't really be worse. From what we saw last season, the talent this year on defense, they basically return almost everybody from the roster last year, tightened up some things in the secondary, brought in a transfer safety in Randon Fontenette from TCU, a former 4-star guy. They also have a freshman, Dante Carter. He's number 21, I believe. He's going to come in and be an immediate impact player in that secondary. But it's all going to come down to if this pass rush and defensive line can get to the quarterback, because the coverage can only do so much. And last year, Vanderbilt just could not get pressure on the quarterback. And the defensive line was actually a position last year that Vanderbilt fans expected to take a step forward. That just didn't happen. So guys like Darren Agu, Wataha on the interior of the defensive line, and then they got some transfers in, and Zaylen Wood here locally from MTSU, and Corday Sidnor, I'm going to butcher that name, but a transfer from Purdue. So they've addressed some things, but it's really, like I said about Clark Lea in general, it's a prove-it mode. Right now, there's no off-season hype train. There's nothing like that going on. So the expectations are high, but at the same time, I don't think Vanderbilt fans or anybody out there should be sitting there and saying, oh, Clark Lea's taken over the defense, all the problems are solved. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I do have high expectations for this defense and think they possibly could surprise some people and be a top half of the SEC defense.
Well, let's show some love to the special teams and talk about those guys. Ohio State transfer Jesse Mirko takes over the punting duties, which should be solid in that role. Kicker Brock Taylor, I found this interesting. He's never attempted a field goal or an extra point at the collegiate level, and it seems like he'll be taking over the kicking duties. Is there anything of note that you can think of in the Vanderbilt special teams, maybe return game, reasons to be excited, concerns, anything specific you're looking for? Because I will say that when you're a team, like a Vanderbilt or anybody else, middle of the pack, lower tier, you're looking to pull some upsets. Special teams, that can be a huge differentiator, can help you steal a game or two.
There's a lot to be concerned about with the special teams. A kicker that's never attempted an actual kick in a game, that's concerning. Brock Taylor came in as a highly recruited guy. So it's basically just going to be, it's a lot different kicking in practice than kicking in games. So we're just going to have to see how that plays out. But getting Mirko, I don't want to say this can get roasted by people, but it's always good to have an experienced, solid punter when you're Vanderbilt football. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an acquisition. I think he's coming from Ohio State. Julian Ashby as the long snapper there. We haven't really seen anything. I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned with lack of experience, but I want to say positive things. I just haven't seen Brock Taylor in real game action, to be honest.
So, Will, the overall outlook for this Vanderbilt football team in the 2024 season, 6 total starters return, which I don't know how much those type of statistics matter anymore with the transfer portal, but either way, 6 starters, 3 on offense, 3 on defense. You take a look at this 2024 schedule. What's so interesting, you open up in the non-conference with Virginia Tech, a great opportunity out of the gate. Then you've got Alcorn State at Georgia State. Should give you an opportunity to start with a winning record. You open up SEC play at Mizzou. You've got Bama at Kentucky, Ball State in the non-conference mixed in, Texas at Auburn, South Carolina at home. Maybe an interesting game there at First Bank Stadium. The bye week, then at LSU, and, of course, your friends from Knoxville come to Nashville as well. So when you look at this schedule, what jumps out to you about the schedule? We talk about most difficult, easiest, most manageable, I should say. It's one of the more difficult in the SEC, I would say. Well, I'm sure you guys would agree. You do get Texas, and, that non-conference game, I think Virginia Tech's going to be a solid team, but I tell you, you can look at it one of two ways. Either, oh, gosh, we have to play Virginia Tech, or what an opportunity to set the tone for the 2024 season. So what stands out to you? What are your takeaways from the slate that awaits Vanderbilt this year?
Jokingly, first immediate take, why the hell is Vanderbilt playing on the road against Georgia State? That doesn't make any sense. Why Vanderbilt is playing a road game
at the old
against
Turner
Georgia
Field.
Thank you, Derek Mason, the previous head coach of Vanderbilt football, for that, because Clark Lea was not part of that scheduling that was going on. Virginia Tech, one of those, all these non-conference schedules are made so far in advance. It's hard to predict where these teams are going to be at. Virginia Tech brings back a ton of experience. I think they're commonly predicted as a dark horse to compete for the ACC this year. I think their over-under in wins is 7.5 or 8.5 right there on the sports books. So immediately it jumps out. Why the hell does Vanderbilt start the year with another Power 4 opponent? That's brutal. 11 a.m. kick. We're going to be out there tailgating, but an 11 a.m. kick against Virginia Tech, that's going to be a good barometer where Vanderbilt's going to be sitting. I think right now they're a 13.5-point underdog at home against Virginia Tech. But like you said, the schedule's brutal. It's always going to be brutal for Vanderbilt. I think they have the 5th ranked strength of schedule heading into the season on one graph I saw. So, you're in the SEC. It's never going to be an easy road, especially when Vanderbilt is the easy opponent on most SEC teams' schedules. So the Georgia State on the road game, but there are 3 games in particular that Vanderbilt has to win. They have to beat Georgia State, they have to beat Alcorn State, and they have to beat Ball State. Those are 3 games. Circle them, highlight them. Vanderbilt fans, if Clark Lea can't beat those 3 teams in year 4, it might be time to move on.
And so to your point, Will, and I would agree with you, you have to win those 3 games. But I've heard this a lot, that folks say, and you mentioned the hot seat chatter about Clark Lea earlier in the show, that people will say that Clark Lea needs to show something, quote unquote, show something to return in 2025 or to show he's the long-term answer. Will, my question for you is, what exactly does that mean? Like, what is, if you could define what is showing something? Is it winning a SEC game? Is it simply just winning those 3 non-conference games you talked about? Does it go beyond wins and losses? Is it something on the field specifically? Like what does that mean? What do Vanderbilt fans, what do we need to see from Clark Lea's team this year?
Beating teams that you are supposed to beat in convincing fashion, like those 3 that I mentioned. And then I think it's not necessarily wins and losses this year. I think it's the intangible things like don't lose to South Carolina 47-6. Come out there, be competitive against teams you were supposed to be competitive against in the SEC. Be competitive against Kentucky. Be competitive against Auburn. Be competitive against, Missouri's going to be pretty solid this year, but be competitive against Missouri and pick up an SEC win. I think this sounds lame, terrible to most SEC fans, but if Vanderbilt's able to win 4 games this season, and I'm assuming that means going 3-1 in non-con and winning and picking up 1 win in SEC play, circling that Auburn game as the game that they can possibly win there. I think that would be a sign of moving in the right direction. And what Vanderbilt is attempting to do this offseason of rebranding themselves, brand new coordinators on both sides of the ball, new strength coach, that those changes are working. Vanderbilt has 53 new players on the roster this year. This is the first roster underneath the Clark Lea regime that has a majority of the players on the roster brought in by Clark Lea and the general manager, Barton Simmons. I think it's 106 of the 120 or so players were brought in by Clark Lea and this staff. So just moving in the right direction, not having those non-competitive games against more middle-tier SEC opponents. So I don't think I can put it in like a win-loss specific scenario necessarily, but I think just winning the games you were supposed to and then competing throughout the SEC schedule.
Will Byrum of the Dore Report does a great job talking all things Vanderbilt Commodores. Will, one last thing before we get you out of here. Let's take Tennessee out of the equation because I feel like that's the obvious one, right? The rivalry game match, if you will. If you could only pick one SEC win, what's the game that you think Vanderbilt fans want the most?
That's a tough question. That's a really good question. So for social media trolling, I'm going to go, and this is not realistic, I'm going to go with Texas. And that is strictly for one reason.
Because
Vanderbilt
of the
fans and SEC media all season have been all offseason have been hitting on this since Texas joined the conference. The all-time record between Texas and Vanderbilt is leading that series 8-3. So if Vanderbilt could win that one, continue to hang that over Texas fans, I'm gonna put out there. But the other rival on the schedule is Kentucky. I mean, in seriousness, the one that you can look at and say potentially Vanderbilt could actually win that one, and it would mean something. I think that's Kentucky. Vanderbilt beat them on the road in 2022 behind Mike Wright on that last second touchdown pass to Will Shepherd. But Kentucky, I would point out on there.
I'll be honest. I'm surprised you didn't say South Carolina. I feel like that's the one after all the heartbreaks over the years and like, what is it, 15 straight or something
I've given up. Vanderbilt fans have given up. Vanderbilt will never beat South Carolina again. They could be national championship contenders, and they will go 11-1 with a loss to South Carolina at this point.
2021 all but kind of confirmed that after that kind of voodoo magic late in that game. So
I'm pretty sure that you can correct me. I'm pretty sure Bobby Johnson was still the head coach last time Vanderbilt beat South Carolina.
That is correct. So it has been quite a while. If anyone tuned in even remembers Bobby Johnson, which I'm sure many of you do, but still, you know how long it was. Will, it's a fantastic conversation. Will Byrum of the Dore Report. Will, tell the folks one more time where they can find you guys, all your great work.
Yep. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the Dore Report. We also post episodes weekly on YouTube. You can just search us the Dore Report. And our podcast is available across all platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. So check us out.
Will, best of luck to the Vanderbilt Commodores this year, my friend. And I appreciate you taking the time. Let's definitely do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.